Some people inherit jewelry, others get land. I got a 150-year-old cabin and a war with the HOA president next door. She strutted up in heels and a fake smile, telling me my home was ruining her property values. Funny, since her house came with vinyl siding and zero soul. If you've ever had someone try to rezone your legacy because it didn't match their beige aesthetic, you know the rage. Let me know in the comments. Karen thought she'd won. She had forms, fines, and a contractor named Brad. But I had something older than her entire neighborhood, and it wasn't just wood and nails. My name is Owen Shepard, and I've been living peacefully in my inherited cabin for the past 5 years. But this place isn't just my home, it's the heart of everything I am and everything my family has ever been. Every morning when I wake up in the same bedroom where my father learned to walk, where my grandfather carved his initials into the windowsill, I feel connected to something larger than myself. The wide plank floors still creak in the exact same spots they did when I was a child visiting during summers, and the stone fireplace my great-grandfather built with his own hands still radiates warmth that goes deeper than just heating the room. This cabin holds 5 generations of family memories, from handwritten recipes tucked behind the kitchen cabinet to the growth marks my cousins and I carved into the back porch doorframe. The place sits in Pine Ridge, where my great-grandfather built this beauty back in the 1800s and 70s. As a local history author currently working on a book about Pine Ridge's development, this cabin serves as both my inspiration and research headquarters. Every room tells a story about how our community grew from wilderness to the thriving area it is today. The hand-hewn beams came from trees that grew on this very land, and the stone foundation was quarried from the creek bed that still runs behind my property. This isn't just history I'm studying, it's history I'm living every single day. For 5 years, I've enjoyed the quiet life here, writing about our community's past while maintaining excellent relationships with longtime neighbors who understood the area's heritage. Mrs. Henderson next door often brought me fresh vegetables from her garden, sharing stories about how the neighborhood looked when she was young. Tom Rodriguez, whose family had lived across the street for 3 decades, would wave from his porch each morning and occasionally stop by to chat about local history for my book research. These were people who understood that some things are worth preserving, that not everything old needs to be replaced with something new and generic. Everything changed 6 months ago when Karen moved into the newly constructed Spring Valley Estates, the cookie-cutter housing development built right next to my historic property. Within weeks, she maneuvered herself into becoming their HOA president, despite having zero experience with community leadership or property law. Karen apparently convinced herself that being elected to manage a small subdivision gave her authority over the entire neighborhood, including properties that predated her development by more than a century. She set her sights on my cabin as her first major conquest, viewing my family's heritage as nothing more than an obstacle to her vision of suburban perfection. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, with me enjoying coffee on my front porch while reviewing research notes. Karen came marching up my driveway with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, clipboard in hand and wearing an expression that suggested she was about to solve a major community crisis. She didn't introduce herself or offer pleasantries. Instead, she launched directly into her demands with the subtlety of a fire alarm at 3 in the morning. This structure, she announced while waving her manicured finger at my home like she was pointing out a public health hazard, was completely destroying the aesthetic harmony of their community standards. Karen informed me that my cabin, with its natural wood siding and historical architecture, was a blight on the landscape that needed immediate correction to meet modern standards. According to her twisted logic, I had exactly 2 choices: completely renovate my family's heritage to match their beige suburban monotony, or pack up and leave the property my family had owned for over a century and a half. The audacity was breathtaking, but what struck me most was her complete inability to understand that some things have value beyond her personal preferences. I calmly explained that my cabin predated their development by more than 100 years and fell completely outside their HOA jurisdiction. I showed her historical maps and property records that clearly demonstrated my land's independence from any modern HOA regulations. The documentation was crystal clear. My cabin existed long before Spring Valley Estates was even conceived, and no homeowners association had any legal authority over my historic property. But Karen wasn't interested in facts, history, or legal boundaries. Her face turned crimson, and she began sputtering about property values and community standards with increasing volume and decreasing coherence. She threatened to find ways to force my compliance, suggesting she had connections that could make my life difficult if I didn't cooperate. As I watched her storm back towards Spring Valley Estates, I noticed Mrs. Henderson peeking through her curtains with concern and support, while Tom Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief from across the street. I thought that would be the end of it. I was completely wrong. This woman had an entire battle plan ready to deploy, and I was about to discover just how far a determined HOA president would go to expand her kingdom of suburban conformity. 1 week after our initial confrontation, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox with the official Spring Valley Estates letterhead emblazoned in gold foil that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budgets. Inside was a 15-page document titled Notice of Violations that read like a legal brief written by someone who had watched too many courtroom dramas but never actually studied law. Karen had spent the entire week cataloging every aspect of my property that offended her suburban sensibilities, creating a comprehensive list of alleged infractions that would have been impressive if it wasn't so completely ridiculous. Each violation was numbered, cross-referenced, and described in excruciating detail, as if Karen had appointed herself as both judge and jury in some kangaroo court of architectural enforcement. The accusations were absolutely absurd, starting with my cabin being classified as an unlawful structure despite existing for a century and a half before their development was even conceived. Karen claimed my home violated their architectural standards because I hadn't painted it the regulation beige color that every house in Spring Valley Estates was required to display. She accused me of noise pollution because birds actually lived in the old-growth trees on my property, creating what she described as an unacceptable disturbance to the sterile silence her residents deserved. My natural landscaping, featuring native plants and trees that had grown here for decades, was condemned as improper landscaping that failed to meet HOA standards for uniformity and maintenance. Brad Thompson appeared at my door that same afternoon, introducing himself as the contractor who would handle all necessary renovations to bring my property into compliance. He delivered his quote with businesslike efficiency: exactly $50,000 to transform my historic cabin into something that would blend seamlessly with the suburban monotony next door. The number was clearly calculated to be financially devastating, while appearing somewhat reasonable for major renovation work, and Brad's nervous smile suggested he knew exactly how ridiculous his proposal sounded to anyone with basic common sense. The situation escalated dramatically when Karen organized an emergency HOA meeting and specifically invited me to attend what she called a compliance hearing. The meeting was held in the Spring Valley Estates Community Center, a sterile conference room with fluorescent lighting and generic corporate artwork. Karen had arranged the room so that I sat alone facing a panel of HOA board members, creating the deliberate atmosphere of a criminal trial where I was clearly the defendant and she was the prosecutor, judge, and jury, all rolled into one terrifying package. Sitting in that chair, facing Karen's carefully orchestrated tribunal, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. These people were trying to erase more than a century of family history because it didn't match their cookie-cutter vision of suburban perfection. I attempted to explain that my cabin fell completely outside their jurisdiction and that their association had no legal authority over my property. Karen interrupted me repeatedly, banging her gavel and citing regulations that applied only to properties within their development boundaries. When I suggested she might want to consult with a real attorney before proceeding further, Karen's face went through several interesting color changes before she declared that she would use every legal means at her disposal to force my compliance. For a split second, I faltered. What if I was wrong? What if some obscure zoning clause or buried regulation gave them control? I'd studied land law, sure, but I wasn't a lawyer. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I was just another man clinging to the past while the world marched on in beige siding and quarterly assessments. That moment of doubt hit me harder than Karen's threats, because deep down, I wasn't afraid of losing a court case. I was afraid of letting down the 5 generations that came before me. As the meeting progressed and Karen's accusations became increasingly outlandish, I felt something inside me begin to crack. Despite all my research and historical knowledge, despite knowing I was legally in the right, the sheer volume of their coordinated attack was overwhelming. What if I was wrong? What if there was some obscure regulation or legal loophole that I had missed? The doubt crept in like cold water, making me question everything I thought I knew about property law and my family's rights to the land we had called home for so many generations. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if I should just give up, sell the cabin, and move somewhere else where I wouldn't have to fight for the right to exist peacefully on my own property. It was then that Margaret Stevens, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire proceeding, cleared her throat and spoke up for the first time. "Excuse me, Karen," she said in a calm but firm voice that cut through the tension in the room. "But I've been thinking about what Mr. Shepard said about his property being outside our jurisdiction. Don't we need to verify our actual authority before we proceed with any enforcement actions? I mean, if he's right about the boundaries, we could be opening ourselves up to legal liability." Her words hung in the air like a lifeline, and I saw several other board members nodding thoughtfully. Karen's expression shifted from confident authority to barely concealed panic, suggesting that Margaret had touched on something Karen hoped no one would think to question. Walking back to my cabin that evening, I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. But Margaret's quiet intervention had given me hope that not everyone in Spring Valley Estates was willing to follow Karen blindly into potentially illegal territory. The doubts still gnawed at me, but I was beginning to realize that I wasn't fighting this battle entirely alone. Some people still believed in doing the right thing, even when it meant questioning authority. I just had to find the strength to keep fighting and the allies who would help me protect what my family had built more than a century ago. 2 weeks after the kangaroo court meeting, Karen launched what can only be described as a coordinated assault on my peaceful existence, throwing every official agency she could think of at my property like she was conducting some kind of bureaucratic blitzkrieg. The attacks came in rapid succession, each one more desperate than the last, creating a perfect storm of harassment that would have been impressive if it wasn't so completely misguided. First came the County Code Enforcement Office, summoned by Karen's complaints about my illegal structure and demands for immediate inspection and condemnation proceedings. When the inspector arrived, took one look at my cabin, checked the historical records, and informed Karen that my property was actually protected under historical preservation guidelines, her response was to accuse him of being bribed and demand a second opinion from a different department. The fire department followed within days, called by Karen's claims that my cabin posed a serious safety hazard to the surrounding community. The fire marshal spent an entire morning conducting a thorough professional inspection, checking electrical systems, structural integrity, and emergency access routes with meticulous attention to detail. After his comprehensive examination, he pronounced my cabin to be in excellent condition and fully compliant with all safety regulations, even complimenting the quality of restoration work my family had maintained over the decades. Karen's reaction was to suggest that the fire marshal was either incompetent or corrupt, apparently unable to accept that professional inspectors might know more about building safety than she did. The police visits became a daily routine, with Karen calling in noise complaints during normal daytime hours when the only sounds coming from my property were occasional bird songs and wind through century-old oak trees. Officers would arrive expecting to find loud parties or construction work, only to discover me quietly working at my computer in what was obviously one of the most peaceful properties in the entire neighborhood. After the third false report in 5 days, Sergeant Rodriguez quietly suggested that I document everything Karen was doing, explaining that her repeated false reports were beginning to constitute harassment under state law, and that continued abuse of emergency services could result in charges against her. It was during one of these ridiculous police visits that I first encountered Susan Chen, and the meeting happened in a way that perfectly illustrated just how far Karen had descended into complete madness. Susan was walking her golden retriever past my property when she witnessed Karen screaming at 2 uniformed officers demanding they arrest me for disturbing the peace while I sat quietly on my porch, drinking coffee and reading a book. The scene was so absurd that Susan actually stopped to watch, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief as Karen's volume increased and her accusations became more unhinged. When the officers finally left, shaking their heads in obvious frustration, Susan approached my porch with the kind of direct confidence that suggested she was used to dealing with difficult people in professional settings. Susan introduced herself as a real estate attorney who had recently moved into one of the older houses on the other side of Pine Ridge, and her first comment was an apology for what she had just witnessed, combined with genuine disbelief that anyone could behave so irrationally over what appeared to be a perfectly normal residential property. As we talked, I discovered that Susan specialized in property law and community governance issues, giving her professional insight into exactly how wrong Karen's approach was from both legal and practical perspectives. Her offer to help me understand my legal position wasn't just neighborly kindness. It was the response of someone who genuinely cared about justice and couldn't stand watching a bully abuse the system to harass innocent people. Susan's initial investigation revealed several disturbing facts about Karen's operation that went far beyond simple neighbor disputes. She discovered that Karen was attempting to illegally expand Spring Valley Estates' jurisdiction, claiming authority over properties that had never been part of their development. Many of the HOA's current regulations violated state laws regarding property rights and community governance, suggesting that Karen either didn't understand the legal framework she was supposed to operate within, or simply didn't care about following laws that limited her authority. Most troubling was Brad Thompson's exclusive contract with the HOA, which was significantly overpriced compared to market rates, and raised serious questions about financial management. As Susan continued her research, I began receiving anonymous notes from neighbors who had been pressured into signing Karen's petitions. These notes, slipped under my door or left in my mailbox, apologized for their author's initial compliance and explained that they had been threatened with lawsuits and property devaluations if they didn't support Karen's crusade against my cabin. Several neighbors admitted they were afraid to speak out publicly because Karen had promised to target their properties next if they opposed her authority, creating an atmosphere of fear that extended far beyond legitimate HOA governance. The situation took a dark turn when I discovered small cameras hidden in the trees around my property, obviously placed there without my knowledge or consent. Finding those devices during my morning walk was like being punched in the stomach, a violation of privacy that transformed our conflict from an annoying neighbor dispute into something that felt genuinely threatening and dangerous. The cameras weren't just illegal, they represented a level of obsession that crossed every reasonable boundary of civilized disagreement, turning Karen from an obnoxious HOA president into someone willing to break serious laws to satisfy her need for control. As I carefully removed each camera and documented their locations, I felt something fundamental shift in my approach to this entire situation. Karen had escalated beyond property disputes into criminal behavior that violated my basic right to privacy and security. If Karen wanted to play games involving surveillance and harassment, I was prepared to play those games too, and I was going to play them much better than she ever imagined possible. With Susan's legal expertise guiding my efforts, I began a comprehensive investigation into the true legal status of our entire area, determined to find the ammunition I needed to fight back against Karen's campaign of intimidation. We spent several productive afternoon sessions in my cabin, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows and illuminating the historical maps and property records spread across my dining room table, like evidence in a detective story. Susan's professional training in property law, combined with my historical research skills, created a formidable investigative team, and we quickly began uncovering information that revealed the true extent of Karen's legal ignorance and the questionable nature of some of her recent activities. It was during one of these research sessions that I remembered something my father had told me as a child about great-grandfather's secret papers hidden somewhere in the cabin. Following that childhood memory, I climbed up to the attic and began searching through boxes of old family papers that had been stored there for decades. Behind a loose board in the far corner, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and time, I found my great-grandfather's original survey maps and land grant documents from the 1800s. One of the documents had a thin, red ink line sketched neatly along the northern boundary, still visible after all these years. Just above it were the initials AS, my great-grandfather's hand, drawn with pride and permanence. That stroke wasn't just a border, it was a message. This is ours. Guard it. As I carefully unfolded the yellowed papers, I could almost hear my father's voice from 30 years ago. Your great-grandfather always said those papers would be important someday, Owen. He told me to make sure the family never lost them, that they were our insurance against anyone who tried to take what we built. My hands trembled as I realized I was holding that insurance policy, drawn in my great-grandfather's careful handwriting and signed by territorial officials who had understood the importance of protecting property rights for future generations. The discovery of these original documents transformed our research from academic exercise into something deeply personal and emotionally powerful. The maps showed not just property boundaries, but mineral rights that extended far beyond my residential property into areas that Karen had been claiming as exclusive HOA territory. These rights, established in the original 1800s land grants, gave me legal access to substantial portions of the surrounding area, including the public easement land that Karen had been illegally restricting with her fraudulent HOA property signs. When Susan explained the full implications of what we had discovered, I had to step outside and sit on my back porch for several minutes, just staring at the creek that had been running behind my property since before my great-grandfather first claimed this land. The magnitude of what we had uncovered hit me like a physical blow. Karen hadn't just been harassing me about my cabin. She had been systematically violating the property rights of an entire community, claiming ownership of spaces that belonged to everyone. But more than that, she had been violating rights that my great-grandfather had specifically secured for his descendants more than a century ago. I felt his presence there with me by the creek, as if he was nodding approvingly at his great-grandson finally understanding the gift he had left us. The mineral rights weren't just legal documents. They were my great-grandfather's way of ensuring that no one could ever push his family off the land he had fought to claim and preserve. While Susan and I were uncovering these legal bombshells, Karen's response to our increased scrutiny revealed just how disconnected from reality her understanding of property law had become. She retained the services of a discount attorney who sent me an impressively formatted cease and desist letter demanding that I immediately stop all activities that violated Spring Valley Estates regulations. Susan read through the letter and actually laughed out loud at the numerous errors and baseless claims, explaining that the attorney had obviously never bothered to research the actual legal relationship between my property and the HOA before making threats that had no foundation in law. The community response to Karen's increasingly erratic behavior began to shift noticeably as more residents became aware of her legal violations and questionable leadership decisions. Robert Chen, Margaret Stevens' husband and a retired civil engineer, had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the HOA's financial management and construction contracts. During a chance encounter at the local hardware store, Robert pulled me aside and shared his findings about inflated contractor payments and unauthorized expenditures that suggested Karen was either grossly incompetent or actively defrauding the HOA membership. "I've been in construction management for 30 years, Robert confided, and I've never seen financial irregularities this blatant. She's running some kind of systematic fraud operation, and we need to stop it before she bankrupts the entire community." Armed with my great-grandfather's original documents, concrete evidence of Karen's legal violations, and growing support from community members who were tired of her authoritarian approach, I realized that I didn't need to limit myself to defensive strategies. Karen had made the fundamental mistake of targeting someone whose family had been preparing for this kind of fight for more than a century, and she was about to discover that some battles are won before they even begin, by people who understood the importance of preserving what matters most for the generations that come after them. Based on our legal research and Susan's professional advice, I decided it was time to turn the tables on Karen's campaign of intimidation and harassment, using the law itself as my weapon of choice. Early on a crisp Saturday morning, I walked over to the area where Karen had illegally posted her HOA property signs and began installing my own signs directly next to hers with the methodical precision of someone who had done their homework. My signs were simple, professional, and completely legal. No trespassing, private property. The legal basis for these signs was something Karen had never bothered to research, despite all her threats and bluster about property law, and her reaction to discovering them was everything I had hoped for and more. The foundation of my counterattack lay in something Karen's amateur legal research had completely missed. Along with inheriting my great-grandfather's cabin, I had also inherited the mineral rights to a substantial portion of the surrounding area, including land that extended well beyond my residential property boundaries into areas Karen had been claiming as exclusive HOA territory. These mineral rights, established in the original 1800s land grants, gave me legal access to areas that Karen had been illegally restricting, and more importantly, her attempts to prevent my access constituted criminal interference with established property rights that predated her HOA by more than a century. Karen had been committing crimes for months without realizing it, and now she was about to face the legal consequences of her ignorance. Karen discovered the signs and launched into one of her trademark meltdowns, screaming across the neighborhood about property rights while flailing at the posts in her bathrobe and slippers. Her attempt to rip them out was as dramatic as it was ineffective, providing exactly the footage I had hoped my cameras would catch. Her struggle with the professionally installed signs, captured in perfect detail by the discreet camera I had positioned to document exactly this kind of behavior, was both hilarious and legally valuable, as evidence of her continued criminal interference with my property rights. When Karen finally gave up her futile battle with the signs and called the police for what must have been at least the 20th time in 2 months, Officers Martinez and Johnson arrived, with the weary expressions of professionals who had dealt with this particular resident far too many times already. She demanded arrests, threatened lawsuits, and insisted the police do their job, as if yelling louder would change the law. But the officers, clearly exhausted, confirmed my signs were legal and reminded her again that personal preference isn't enforceable. Officer Martinez explained that the police couldn't enforce personal preferences when those preferences conflicted with actual legal statutes and established property rights. He also mentioned that Karen's pattern of false reports was approaching the threshold for charges of abuse of emergency services, which could result in significant legal consequences if her behavior continued. This warning only seemed to intensify Karen's fury, and she began questioning the officer's competence and integrity while they exchanged knowing looks. But Karen's desperation reached a new low that very night when she apparently decided that if she couldn't remove my signs legally, she would do it under cover of darkness. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my security cameras captured Karen sneaking across the easement area with a crowbar and flashlight, attempting to vandalize and remove my professionally installed signs without being detected. The camera caught her in full pajama and crowbar mode, muttering curses while failing to dislodge a single post. She looked like a suburban ninja having a breakdown, and gave me the best footage of her escalating behavior yet. Her failed midnight sabotage mission was not only illegal destruction of property, but it also provided me with perfect evidence of her escalating criminal activity and complete disregard for the law she claimed to represent. The situation reached its dramatic crescendo the following Saturday afternoon, when Karen organized what she dramatically announced as a community action rally to demand the removal of my illegal signage and restore proper HOA authority over neighborhood property standards. She managed to convince about a dozen Spring Valley Estates residents to join her march to my property line, complete with homemade signs and coordinated outfits that looked like a suburban parody of a political protest movement. Karen led her protesters with the confidence of someone who had never seriously questioned her own version of reality, apparently convinced that mob intimidation would succeed where legal threats, police complaints, and midnight vandalism had failed so spectacularly. But the rally began to fall apart almost immediately when Margaret Stevens, one of Karen's own board members and a longtime Spring Valley resident, publicly questioned the legal basis for their protest in front of the entire assembled group. "Karen," Margaret said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "if the police have already confirmed that his signs are legal, what exactly are we protesting here? Are we really going to make fools of ourselves arguing with the law?" Her challenge created an immediate ripple of uncertainty through the crowd, with several protesters beginning to mutter among themselves about whether they had been given accurate information about the situation they were being asked to support. The confrontation collapsed entirely when Margaret continued her public questioning, pointing out that Karen had never provided any actual legal documentation to support her claims about HOA authority over properties outside their development boundaries. "I've been asking for weeks to see the legal opinions that justify our actions," Margaret announced to the increasingly uncomfortable crowd, "and Karen keeps promising to provide them later. Well, it's later now, and I think we deserve to see the legal basis for what we're being asked to support." Karen's inability to produce any credible legal authority, combined with her increasingly frantic insistence that everyone should trust her interpretation over that of law enforcement professionals, caused the protest to disintegrate as people quietly began leaving the group and walking back toward their homes. By the end of the afternoon, Karen was essentially conducting a one-person rally while I watched from my porch, documenting everything for potential future legal proceedings and enjoying the spectacle of someone who had finally pushed their delusions of authority beyond what even their own supporters were willing to accept. The woman had managed to alienate her own board members and destroy her credibility with the very people she claimed to represent, all while providing me with excellent evidence of her continued harassment, criminal vandalism, and her complete inability to understand basic property law. But Karen's humiliation in front of her own community was just the beginning of her downfall. And the most satisfying part of this entire story was still coming. Karen's failed protest rally marked the beginning of a domino effect that would ultimately destroy not just her campaign against my cabin, but her entire position of authority within the Spring Valley Estates community. The residents who had witnessed her public meltdown and inability to provide legal justification for her actions began asking serious questions about their HOA leadership, wondering aloud whether someone who couldn't understand basic property law should be making financial decisions and community policies that affected their property values and quality of life. Susan helped organize informal information sessions where concerned residents could learn about their actual rights and responsibilities under legitimate HOA regulations, creating a stark contrast between real legal knowledge and Karen's increasingly desperate fantasy version of community governance. The community awakening accelerated when several longtime Spring Valley residents approached me privately to apologize for their initial support of Karen's campaign, sharing stories about the fear tactics and misinformation she had used to build opposition to my cabin. She told us your property would destroy our home values, confided Janet Morrison, a retired teacher who lived 2 streets over from Karen. She said if we didn't support her, she'd make sure the whole neighborhood turned into a slum filled with non-compliant properties. We were scared, and we trusted her because she was our president. But after watching her today, I don't think she knows what she's talking about, and I'm worried about what else she might be wrong about. These conversations revealed that Karen's support had been built on intimidation rather than genuine community concern, and that foundation was crumbling as people began to understand the true legal situation. Susan's investigation into the financial aspects of Spring Valley Estates operations uncovered problems that made Karen's misunderstanding of property law seem minor by comparison. The HOA's books revealed a pattern of financial irregularities that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud, with Karen approving payments for projects that showed no visible evidence of completion and maintenance contracts that were significantly overpriced compared to market standards. When Susan presented her preliminary findings to the remaining board members, their expressions shifted from concern to horror as they realized the potential legal and financial liability they faced as a result of Karen's management decisions. The next HOA meeting became a confrontation that would determine Karen's political survival, and she approached it with the kind of desperate energy that suggested she understood exactly how much was at stake. Instead of addressing the financial concerns that had been raised, Karen chose to double down on her attacks against me, apparently believing that a successful crusade against my cabin would distract attention from questions about her competence and integrity. She had prepared what she called a comprehensive presentation about the ongoing threat to community standards, complete with professionally printed charts and carefully selected photographs designed to make my historic cabin appear as threatening as possible to suburban property values. But Karen's elaborate presentation backfired spectacularly when board member Margaret Stevens stood up during the middle of the slideshow and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Actually, Robert Chen added, rising from his seat with a folder in hand, there's something the board needs to see. He opened it slowly. These vendor authorizations and payment approvals from 2 years ago. Most of them have signatures from board members who were never even present at those meetings. A murmur spread through the room. Margaret frowned. Karen, did you sign these yourself? Silence. Then denial. But the damage was done. The room fell silent as Karen struggled to provide a coherent answer, her face cycling through several interesting color changes as she realized that her own presentation had inadvertently provided evidence of questionable financial management and possible misuse of community funds. The meeting deteriorated rapidly as other residents began asking pointed questions about specific financial discrepancies and Karen's refusal to provide documentation for her claims about legal authority over properties outside their development. When longtime board member Robert Chen asked to see the legal opinions that justified Karen's campaign against my property, Karen's claim that she had consulted with attorneys fell apart under basic questioning about which attorneys, when, and what specific advice they had provided. Her inability to produce any credible legal authority, combined with her increasingly frantic behavior, created an atmosphere of complete loss of confidence in her leadership. That's when Karen completely lost control in a way that shocked everyone in the room. As the questions intensified and her answers became more desperate, she suddenly swept her arm across the presentation table, sending her carefully prepared charts and financial documents flying across the room in a cascade of paper and fury. You people don't understand anything, she screamed, her voice breaking with a mixture of rage and panic. I'm trying to protect this community from people who want to destroy everything we've built here. You're all too stupid to see what's happening. Tears began streaming down her face as she pointed wildly at various board members, accusing them of conspiracy and betrayal. Margaret, you've always been jealous of my position. Robert, you're probably working with him to sabotage me. None of you deserve to live in a community this nice. The room sat in stunned silence as Karen's emotional breakdown continued, her accusations becoming more unhinged and personal with each passing moment. Margaret Stevens made a motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president, citing concerns about mental stability, financial management, and decision-making abilities that had endangered the entire community. The motion passed by an overwhelming margin, with only Karen voting against her own removal, effectively ending her reign of terror over our peaceful neighborhood. As the votes were counted and Karen's defeat became official, she stormed out of the meeting shouting threats about lawsuits and promising that everyone would regret their decision to oppose her vision for community governance. But her voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose power had been based on intimidation and misinformation, rather than genuine authority or competence. The final chapter of Karen's downfall began when Susan's investigation into the HOA's financial records uncovered systematic signature forgery on multiple documents, revealing a pattern of criminal behavior that ensured Karen's troubles would extend far beyond losing an election. Detective Williams filed formal charges including multiple counts of forgery, fraud, and violations of state laws regarding illegal restriction of public access. Karen's real estate license was immediately suspended, effectively ending her career and creating a web of financial liability through civil lawsuits that would follow her for years to come. The community healing process began with concrete action, rather than just meetings and discussions. The day after Karen's criminal charges were announced, I watched from my cabin porch as a remarkable scene unfolded in the public easement area that Karen had tried to claim as private property. Margaret Stevens and Robert Chen had organized a group of Spring Valley residents to install a new community bulletin board, where Karen's fraudulent HOA property signs had once stood. But this wasn't just any bulletin board. It was a beautiful cedar structure with a brass nameplate reading Pine Ridge Community Rights and Responsibilities Board, and the first document posted was a simplified, resident-friendly explanation of actual property law and HOA authority limits that Susan had helped draft. "We're not going to let this happen again," Margaret announced to the small crowd that had gathered to watch the installation. "From now on, every HOA decision gets posted here for 30 days before implementation, with legal citations and contact information for residents who want to verify the information independently. No more secret meetings, no more made-up regulations, and definitely no more claiming authority we don't actually have." The crowd applauded, and I noticed several people taking photos of the new board with their phones, apparently planning to share the idea with other communities dealing with similar HOA overreach problems. My cabin received official recognition as a local historical landmark, complete with a bronze plaque that I installed near the front entrance. The landmark status provided legal protection against future attempts at forced modification, but more importantly, it represented the community's acknowledgement that some things are worth preserving simply because they connect us to our shared history and heritage. During the small ceremony marking the landmark designation, Susan stood beside me as the County Historical Commission chairman read the official proclamation, and I felt the weight of my great-grandfather's legacy settling comfortably on my shoulders. Susan and I had developed a partnership that evolved naturally from professional collaboration into something much more personal during our months of legal research and community organizing. The turning point came during one of our afternoon research sessions, when she looked up from reviewing property deeds and smiled with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with legal strategy. "You know," she said quietly, "I moved here looking for a peaceful place to build a practice, and instead I found myself in a neighborhood war. But I also found something I wasn't looking for." She decided to stay permanently, opening her solo practice in a restored Victorian house that perfectly complemented our neighborhood's historical character. Karen's departure happened on a cold November morning, with moving trucks and no fanfare. While the community celebrated its liberation with a barbecue in the easement area she had tried to steal. As Susan and I sat on my cabin's front porch that evening, watching families enjoy the walking trails that were once again open to everyone, I reflected on how much had changed since Karen first marched up my driveway with her clipboard and delusions of authority. That's when Susan pulled a letter from her jacket pocket, her expression mixing excitement with curiosity. "This came to my office today," she said, unfolding the paper carefully. "It's from someone in Riverside County, about 3 hours south of here." She handed me the letter, and I read the neat handwriting. "Mission Chen, we heard about your success with the Pine Ridge property rights case. We have a similar situation developing here involving a planned community that's trying to claim jurisdiction over a 19th century ranch that's been in our family for 4 generations. The developers are using the same tactics you encountered, including fraudulent boundary claims and illegal restriction of historical access roads. Would you and Mr. Shepard consider consulting on our case? We can offer substantial compensation and cover all travel expenses. This isn't just about one property. There are at least 6 other historical properties in our area facing similar threats." Susan looked at me with the same gleam in her eyes that I had seen when we first discovered my great-grandfather's mineral rights documents. "Well," she said, folding the letter carefully, "it seems like Karen wasn't the only person around here who doesn't understand property law. The question is, are you ready to take this show on the road?" I looked out at my great-grandfather's cabin, standing solid and proud in the fading light, and realized that some fights are too important to fight just once. I could almost hear the old floorboards creak from here, as if the cabin itself was nodding in approval. Somewhere inside, the faint scent of cedar and old paper lingered, a smell that always reminded me of rainy afternoons spent listening to my father's stories. The past was never gone here, it simply waited for its turn to guide the future. The framed "No Trespassing" sign, hanging in my living room, represented more than just my victory. It was a symbol that other families fighting similar battles might need to see. "Riverside County," I said, already imagining the possibilities. "I wonder what kind of historical documents they have hidden in their attic."